It's good to see you today. I hope you're having a good day as the week comes to a close. Come on with us to the book of Acts today. We're going to be thinking about being all things to all men. We're going to be looking in Paul's trial. And to think about that quote, all things to all men, Paul uses that, writes that in another place. To the Jew, he became a Jew. To the Gentile, he became a Gentile. That concept, it's interesting to look at his trial because I would suggest that concept is not on display in any greater way than during his trial and the chapters that we read of that trial in the book of Acts. So let's get over there and let's read a little bit. This is Acts chapter 21, and we're just not going to be able to read the entire thing, but it is interesting. Here in Acts chapter 21, you have Paul who's going to be arrested in the temple. Needless to say, the Jews didn't care for Paul a whole lot. So you have them stirring up the crowd, such things as that, but you also have the Roman soldiers there. So the multitude of the people, verse 30, chapter 21, verse 36, the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him." And then as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins into the wilderness?" So we'll pause right there just for a second to make this first point. He says to the commander, "Can I speak to you?" And the commander says, "Can you speak Greek?" He thought he was an Egyptian. So we'll start with the first one about being all things to all men. Can you speak Greek? And Paul says, "Yes, I can. Yes, I can." To the Gentiles, he became a Gentile. And to think about what that means, and we're gonna talk about what allowed all this to happen. And it doesn't mean that he was without law. That's not what it means. That doesn't mean that he disobeyed, that he somehow that he was without law towards them. Trying to think of the right word and I can't quite think of it. Okay, he was still obeying the Lord, but in the Lord he had freedom. And like I said, we'll talk more about that here in a second. But that's what he was. To the Jews, he was a Jew. To the Gentiles, he was a Gentile. Would that have involved dietary issues? Perhaps so. Remember what he says: if eating meat offends my brother, I'll never eat meat again. But in another place, he talks about eating meat with a good conscience. He says, "Ask no questions for conscience sake." Such things as that. To the Gentiles, he became a Gentile. The commander says, "Do you speak Greek?" And he says, "Yes, yes, I can." And I understand that's just a small little snippet, but just the mentality. And it's just interesting to look at the trial to go on, because in the next passage, when we look at it, look at what happens. The fellow says, "Aren't you the Egyptian?" Paul says, "No." He says, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. So now we've gone on from the man says, "Do you speak Greek?" And he says, "Yeah, I speak Greek." And then when he's talking to the Jews, all of a sudden he doesn't speak Greek to them. He speaks in the Hebrew language. To the Jew, I became a Jew. Earlier in the previous chapter or two, you're going to have the account where he pays the expense for certain people to make sacrifices. Right? He was keeping the law. He was keeping the old law towards the Jews. Towards the Jews, he was keeping the old law. He was doing these things. He had that liberty. He had that liberty. Once again, if eating meat offended his brother, he's not going to eat meat. So, did he speak Greek? Yeah. Did he speak Hebrew? Yeah. To the Gentiles, he was a Gentile. To the Jews, he was a Jew. But then we move on, back to our passage. Look over in chapter 22. And like I said, we don't have time to read the whole thing. But over in chapter 22, as all of this was happening, and as he recounts what had happened to him, and as he starts defending himself and such things as that, look down in chapter 22 at verse 20, we'll start reading verse 22. They say, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he's not fit to live." Then as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging, so that he might know how they shouted, why they shouted so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do, for this man is Roman." The commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." The commander answered, "With a large sum I obtained this citizenship." Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." So it starts off, the man says, "Do you speak Greek?" "Yes, I do." And then when he speaks to the Jews, he speaks in the Hebrew language. And then when things are getting even more serious, what card does he play? He says, "I'm a Roman. I'm a Roman." And who's he going to appeal to? He's going to appeal to Caesar. We're not saying any of these things, and we'll come back to this idea. We're not saying any of these things supersede him being a Christian. It's just interesting, the cards that he plays as he's on trial. To the Gentiles, he was a Gentile. To the Jews, he was a Jew. To the Romans, he was a Roman. And rightfully so. He's not making it up. It just so happens this is who he is. He is able to say truthfully, "You bought your citizenship. I was born this way. I was born a Roman." Not everybody could appeal to Caesar. We find ourselves in circumstances, and it is not wrong to use those circumstances to advance the cause of Christ. That is what Paul is doing. But he's not done yet. He's not done yet. And we actually see it all through this. But here in the account, look over in chapter 23 now. Over in chapter 23, as you have all of this happening, and it's just interesting, as he's before the council, he says, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." We might come back to that because he brings that up again in another place nearby. But down in chapter 23, as he's there before the council, and notice what happens. Verse 6, But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." When he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided, because the Sadducees say there's no resurrection. He basically pits them against themselves, is what he does. But the way he does it is interesting. He does not say, "Men and brethren," there in verse 6, "I was a Pharisee." He doesn't say that. He says, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I'm being judged." He could not say, as you think about it, he could not say, "I'm a Sadducee," because he was not a Sadducee. He had never been a Sadducee, and the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, so he could not align himself with the Sadducees' position. But he had been a Pharisee, and he was a Pharisee in that sense. He says, "I am a Pharisee." And he's aligning himself with that position concerning the resurrection of the dead, because that's what they were mocking and that's what they were judging about, was the resurrection of the dead. That was one of the things they could not stand, because Jesus had been raised from the dead, and Paul was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And he plays the card. He says, "I'm a Pharisee, and I'm being judged about the resurrection of the dead." It's just interesting all through the trial. Do you speak Greek? Yep, I sure do. Do you speak Hebrew? Yeah, I speak that too. Oh, and you're a Roman? Yep, I'm a Roman. And guess what? I'm also a Pharisee. And he plays that card. Now to look back in the account, look over in chapter 24. Over in chapter 24, as he's defending himself and preaching the truth. Frankly, that's what he's really doing. He's really just preaching the truth. Look at what he says in verse 16. He says, "This being so," and notice verse 15, he mentions the resurrection of the dead. Actually, back all the way up to verse 14. This is the point. He says, "But this I confess to you, that according to the way according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. Yesterday we talked about how, or I believe it was Wednesday, we talked about how God's eyes are on both the evil and the good. There's a resurrection of the dead, both the just and the unjust. Verse 16, this being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. So to think about that passage, and I want to leave it up for a moment. What allowed Paul to be able to play these cards? Yes, I speak Greek. Yes, to the Jews I became a Jew, to the Gentiles I became a Gentile, to the Romans, frankly, I'm a Roman, even to the Pharisees, I am a Pharisee. What allowed him to do these things? It was the liberty that was found in that verse 14, according to the way which they call a sect. It is being a Christian that allowed him to do these things, that gave him the liberty to do these things. Verse 16, he was using the liberty that he had, striving to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. He was living peaceably with all men as much as possible, as much as lieth within him. So, to the Greeks, he became Greek. To the Jews, he became a Jew. Even to the Romans, he plays that card. I'm a Roman. Even they're dealing with the Pharisees. And that's the strange one. And I think there's more, it's more the idea he sets them against themselves. But still, it was being a Christian, following the way, that allowed him to be all things to all men. He was striving to have a conscience without offense towards God and man. And that's what we have to do as well. We are trying to persuade people, just like Paul was trying to persuade people to become Christians. That's what Agrippa is going to say in these chapters. You almost persuade me to be a Christian. That was Paul's goal, and that is our goal as well. I hope this study's been helpful to you. Hope you've had a good week, and I hope you have a good weekend as we look into God's Word, a little bit of our daily bread. I hope it's been useful for you as we make applications to our own lives. Thanks for being with us. Hope to see you Monday.